What's up, my wizards? It's Dev, SBMTG. We like magic, and I got a good one for you today, guys. Seriously, this is maybe the best deck in Standard right now, question mark. Seriously, this is a strong list today, and it's already produced results in this Standard. Here's Blue-White Historic. Now, I've been excited about this deck since before the whole set was even spoiled. I put it in a couple of Patreon polls, but it never quite got voted through. But I have to cover it now, because over the weekend this deck showed up and showed out. This is a real threat now. At the Magic Online Pro Tour Qualifier, multiple builds of this deck were in the field, and even better, right up the street from me at the Star City Games Tournament in Atlanta, this deck placed second, and there were other builds of it in the field as well. Now, I'm going to give you the version that I've been working on this whole time. It's a little bit different, but actually not that different at all. It's only like 2 cards different than a lot of these other builds that have produced results already, but I'll also leave you a link to the deck that took second at the Star City Games Tournament in the description. So, with all that said, let's go ahead and get into it, because this deck has some crazy plays. Now, the first card I want to talk about is not necessarily the most important card in the deck. We can win without it, but it enables us to do all the craziest stuff that this deck wants to do. So I gotta talk about the 3 copies of Wrath Compassion first. It turns out all that stuff that sounded like Christmas Land that people wanted to do with Wrath during spoiler season wasn't Christmas Land. I mean, the majority of this is just 2-card combos. You know, if you want to cast your big, dumb, stupid flying creature at instant speed, or your big, dumb, stupid planeswalker at instant speed, Wrath's got your back. He can do that. That's kind of the whole thing he does, so it's really not that far-fetched to do some really stupid stuff with Wrath in this deck, because a lot of our threats are already, like, objectively some of the best cards in Standard right now, so making those threats instant speed and able to be played during your opponent's combat step, or at the end of your opponent's turn, or in response to whatever, just crosses the line of cute and goes into, like, dangerous territory. Like, we can do straight-up broken stuff because Wrath is in this deck. But even at the floor of this card, it's just like a flash flying blocker that you can just play as removal, effectively, if you don't have any dumb legends or historic cards in your hand that you want to cast right then and there. You can also just be played as removal in a pinch. So if you're in a bind, you can do that with them, but mostly save your Wraths because you can do some really filthy, stupid junk in this deck with the Wrath Compassion out. And it's actually not too tough, because a lot of it you can do on curve. For instance, Lyra Dawnbringer. We're also going to play 3 copies of this because it's just maybe the single best card in Standard after a week or so of getting to play her. She's just crazy. She's the biggest threat in the air right now that anyone has to worry about. She can take out just about anything that's either swinging into her or that she's swinging into. She can do it with first strike, so she usually survives, and she's just going to be gaining you life the entire time, whether she gets blocked or she gets through. So whether you're behind when you cast her or you're already ahead, it's just always a good time for Lyra. You know, either catch you back up in a hurry or put you way farther ahead. Lyra forces a lot of scoops, and that's just when you can just cast her for 5 mana during your, one of your main phases. Turns out that when you can cast Lyra at instant speed, she gets really disgusting, whenever your opponent swings in with just about anything, from Rekindling Phoenix to the Scarab God to Glory Bringer, whatever. You just play your play your Lyra slapper down, and you're gonna win that combat step and gain a bunch of life completely out of nowhere. So Lyra's good with Wrath, and she's good by herself. Again, like I said a second ago, a lot of our cards are already the best threats in Standard, and Lyra definitely applies. We're also going to play 2 Walking Ballista, because this is historic. We can cast this at instant speed with a Wrath out, and that's really just, we shouldn't be able to do that. It just feels kind of broken, Ballista's already a decent enough card. This is effectively a mid-range deck in a lot of ways. We want to play at instant speed like a control deck does. There's lots of ways we can, but if we absolutely have to cast a Walking Ballista, at sorcery speed during our main phase, we can do it. We can do that, it's fine, if you've got no better answer, Walking Ballista's there. But the really dumb stuff begins very late in the game when you top deck a Walking Ballista and you have a Wrath out. Because then you can play it as removal at instant speed, just an instant speed removal trick, You can play it as a combat trick, block a dude, kill it, deal a couple of damage to another dude, so long as Ballista still has enough power to kill the dude it blocked, Lots of tricks, and of course there's always the coup de grace. If you have enough mana, you can hit him for the last 4 or 5 damage very late in the game with an instant speed Ballista. Just all the tricks with the Wrath out are dumb enough, but again, just like Lyra, Walking Ballista is one of those cards that's just good enough on its own, and this one has proven itself over a couple of years. Walking Ballista, it's no surprise, is a good card, but when you can cast it at the end of your opponent's turn, it's too much. It's too much. You also might be noticing the budget is getting too much already, and it's not going to end anytime soon. This is an expensive deck, but it's all the power in the world at your fingertips. So with that in mind, we're going to also play 3 copies of History of Benalia in this deck. That's right, it goes in here too. The card is definitely different in this deck. There are times where you're going to cast this on turn 3. Again, it's very situational, but that just actually makes it versatile. But very often you're not looking to cast this on turn 3. You're looking to get your Wrath Compassion down, and then once you get, 5, 6 mana, you can throw down History and have more mana to play with. Throwing down History during the opponent's combat step is actually kind of cool, and throwing it down at the end of their turn is even better a lot of the time, because you'll immediately get a Knight token, and then when you go and draw your card, you'll get another Knight token. So it's like getting even more immediate value out of History than you normally would. And it kind of sets the clock even faster on that third lore counter. So casting History during your opponent's turn is actually ridiculous because it completely changes the way the card functions, speeds the card up, and gets you those tokens way faster. So the card is already dumb. I'm going to say that about all the threats we're playing, but this is another card that's already proven itself in the standard. It showed up in multiple lists. It's a versatile piece, and even though it's different in function than it is in most decks, in this deck, still worth playing. Definitely. This can close the game out very quickly, give you the blockers you need to, and even after a sweeper, which we will get hit by sometimes, sweepers are actually fairly effective against us when we get our board developed. This can get us right back on board. So there's a lot of really good stuff about History under normal circumstances. When you can cast it for flash, it just becomes even dumber. But there's one more thing we're playing that we can flash in, given that we have a Wrath out, and that's the 2 copies of Teferi that we're playing. Now, you can't use Planeswalker's abilities on your opponent's turn, but it is really nice to be able to flash this in at the end of your opponent's turn. Now, in our best cards in Dominaria video, I called this possibly the best Planeswalker since Chandra Torch of Defiance, and I stand by that after a couple of weeks in the format. This card has already proven itself. People are going crazy over it because it is that good. People compared it to Ob Nixilis in the beginning, but I think this is way better than Ob Nixilis, A guaranteed extra draw every turn and untapping lands makes it a lot easier to cast cards on your turn if need be, and then still get your shields up. And, being able to effectively remove any non-land permanent for a few turns is important too, especially once you draw the counterspell that you need. Just put it back into their library. They'll draw it a couple of turns later, and you'll have the counterspell up and ready for it. By the way, pro tip, as far as that goes, there are multiple ways that you can do this, but just to remind yourself that they're going to draw that card, a good way to do it is as soon as you use the ability, put a die that's on 2 on top of your library. Then, whenever you go to draw a card, click it down, and once it hits 0, you'll know to hold mana up because they're going to recast that threat again. Pro tip, multiple ways you can do that. That's the way I've been doing it. But in any case, there's a lot of cool stuff about Teferi outside of that because he also has a ridiculous ultimate that wins the game. It doesn't win the game by itself. You need some other threat to be attacking to actually have this win, but this actually forces a lot of scoops without you ever having to lift a finger aside from drawing cards every single turn. And if you just +1 Teferi, if he remains around after he ultimates, that is at least 2 permanents that exile every single turn, and just about nobody can actually stand up to that. I mean, once you start exiling their lands and you get them down to just a few lands, I mean, it's essentially over at that point. All you have to do is draw a creature and you win the game, and they know it. But we are playing some creatures in this deck that just have flash on their own. They don't need some other piece to tell them what to do, so you just flash them into play. And the first of those is the 4 copies of Merfolk Trickster that we're playing in this deck. This card is true to its name. There are a lot of tricks up this card's sleeve. One thing you can do with this is, just like a Wrath, you can just flash it in as early game removal as early as turn 2 to just block and trade with a creature, which is fine. You've effectively cast a 2 mana instant speed removal spell during their combat step, which is pretty awesome, but there's obviously lots of other stuff you can do with this, You can initiate double blocks on Rekindling Phoenixes and Hazarets and Scarab Gods and do away with abilities like Indestructible which is really important some of the time. And even on Phoenix and Scarab God, when they die, they've lost all their abilities, so Scarab God doesn't have that ability that lets him come back after he dies. Doesn't work, doesn't proc. Same thing with Rekindling Phoenix, if he doesn't have any abilities when he dies, he won't make that little dude that lets him come back, so this is also good against all of the big threats in the format, but it's also a decent creature to just throw down and trade in the early game, but it's more than that. Remember that this essentially has two different modes on it. When your opponent declares their attack step, you can flash it in right there, tap down their best attacker to lock it down, make it not attack, and then threaten to block something else if they choose to attack. Or you can wait until their creatures actually do tap to attack, and then flash it into block whatever's already attacked. And that's actually sort of a hidden mode on both this and Wrath of Passion, and really all of our flash creatures in this deck, is that they will be able to get over abilities like Earthshaker Kenra or On-Crop Crasher that would normally keep our creatures from blocking. Well, our creatures flash in after those abilities go off, so they never have to worry about them. And it seems like that's not that big of a piece of tech, but honestly, in a matchup like Mono Red Aggro that is traditionally a bad matchup for this deck, every little piece of tech counts, and that one definitely does. And we're also going to play a couple of copies of Tori here. Torrential Gearhulk isn't as powerful as it usually would be in this deck, because a lot of, blue-based control decks will play like 20, 22, or more spells a lot of the time, but we're not doing that. We're playing a bunch of threats that aren't necessarily spells. So there's only about 10 targets out of the graveyard for Torrential, but they're just as good as they've ever been, obviously. Draw extra cards or play a removal piece out of your graveyard, like Blink of an Eye, or Settle the Wreckage is playable in this deck out of the graveyard with your Torrential Gearhulk. That's always been one of the best plays in Standard. It's available to us in this deck. Even if there's not a whole lot of instants we can play off of this, there are enough that it's important. So, same thing with counterspells. Casting a counterspell off of a Torrential has always been a blowout. We have plenty of access to that play in this deck. So I think it's still important to play a couple of copies. And even if you don't have anything in your graveyard that you can actually, play for free with this, it's still a 5/6 flash dude. Hey, Julie, what's up? But it's still a 5/6 flash dude that attacks well, blocks well, out of nowhere some of the time. This is actually a great card in conjunction, by the way, with Merfolk Trickster. Because if you have a Torrential Gearhulk out already, if you have 8 mana, you can flash them both in at the same time. That's the dream, but if you have a Torrential Gearhulk out and you flash in a Merfolk Trickster during their combat step, Torrential can block just about any creature in the format, kill it, and live, Lyra Dawnbringer, Glorybringer, Hazoret, Rekindling Phoenix, all of the biggest, dumbest threats that everyone's playing in this format right now. As long as you have a Trickster and a Torrential Gearhulk, you can take care of every single one of those. Now, even with all those nasty threats, we still have room for 15 different spells in this deck. And just like our threats, these are some of the best spells in all of Standard, starting with the 4 copies of Seal Away. Now, my list might be different from the lists that played in the Star City Games tournament this weekend, and those lists are different from the ones that were on the Magic Online Pro Tour qualifier. But the one constant between pretty much every list is that they play the full playset of this card, because it is the truth. It is the great hope that Blue-White has been waiting for this whole time. We thought it was Baffling End. It was decent. It was decent for a few months, but this is everything Baffling End was, and way more. Now, just about every creature that's important in Standard taps to attack. You'll almost never have to worry about like a Vigilant creature. There are a couple in Standard, but for the most part, not that much of a concern. And even creatures that don't typically attack will still attack. Like the Scarab God, everyone says, oh, he never attacks. Whatever, he's 5/5. I see him attack all the time. So unless they are playing around Seal Away, then you can catch a Scarab God an awful lot of the time with Seal Away, and those decks don't have a whole lot of options to deal with it once it's actually down. And if they are playing around Scarab God and not swinging with it, then you've won. You haven't won the game, but you've at least won that exchange. So if it's nothing but a good thing if they are playing around Seal Away. Another cool thing about Seal Away is that we can play it off of Teferi when we +1 him. Even if we tapped out for Teferi when we played him, we can still get in a Seal Away when our opponent attacks to help protect our Teferi. That's important. And another card, by the way, we can do that with is Blink of an Eye. Not quite as effective, but still a card that's been pretty much universal between all the blue-white control lists that I saw over the weekend. And I can definitely see why. This card is relevant for a lot of reasons. I know that Bounce tends to turn some people off, and usually that makes sense because with Bounce, it's virtual card disadvantage, you know. They get their guy back eventually, they'll play him again, but you lost your card. Blink of an eye, not a problem if you want to sink a couple of extra mana into it. It replaces itself. That's good enough, and it's a blowout play when Hazoret attacks on turn 4. You know, if you've got the mana for it, return Hazoret to their hand, take away their turn 4, and draw a card. Pretty sweet play, but there's way more than that Blink of an Eye does in this deck. I've already said you can play it off of Teferi. That's important. It's an important play off of Torrential Gearhulk. Sometimes, and remember, even though you're playing the spell for free, you can still sink a couple of extra mana into it to kick it if you got that mana. Perfectly legal to do so. This is actually much better than it might look at first glance, and, by the way, one more thing, saves our permanents, you know, saves Teferi if they do have a way to deal with it, saves Wrath Compassion if he's in trouble, saves History of Benalia if it's in trouble. We can reset History of Benalia with it. That's important, you know. Torrential Gearhulk, we can get the Enter the Battlefield trigger off of again. There's so many cool things. If they actually have an answer to Alira, we can save it. Just a super important card, because it sort of acts as a negate when we need it to. Now, to go with the Sealaways, I'm actually just going to play one copy of Cast Out in the main deck here, just in case there are non-creature threats that we want to take out. You know, Sealaway is great against attacking creatures and creatures that tap to do stuff, like even Lawnmower Elf sometimes, you know, but don't make that play. But in any case, this can take out everything else, you know, things like obviously Godfarer's Gift and enchantments. For instance, other players' Sealaways and Cast Outs. It's actually relevant a lot of the time. Plus, sagas like History of Benalia this can take out. Just Cast Out is really flexible, and I admire that in this format. I'm actually running one main deck negate, and I'm not the only one doing this. There are a couple of lists that are running a couple of copies, 2 copies of main deck negate. I don't want to go that far, but I do want to play at least the 1 copy because we're trying to protect a lot of different creatures and planeswalkers in this deck. It's worth noting that when you get your Teferi down, you can untap 2 lands, draw a card, and have negate up just in case they try to Vraska's Contempt your Teferi. That's an important play too. This can also deal with Settle the Wreckages and stuff when you're looking to get in, so this deals with all kinds of important stuff, you know, Chandra's, other planeswalkers, Godfarer's Gift, Refurbish that's trying to get the Godfarer's Gift out of the graveyard, Gate to the Afterlife that will eventually get the Godfarer's Gift. There's a lot of stuff that you can hit with a negate right now, way more than you might think. This is a really relevant piece. Now, one of the biggest ways that my list differs from any of the lists I saw over the weekend is that I'm running 2 copies of Essence Scatter, but this card seems to have fallen out of favor with a lot of tournament players. I'm not really sure why. I still think Essence Scatter is one of the better cards in the format. You know, I've been talking about some of the creatures, some of the threats that we have to worry about right now, and this takes them all out for 2 mana, given that you can, you know, play it while they're trying to resolve. And this is something else that Teferi can cast off of its +1 when you untap those lands. I think it's important to have more counterspells we can do that with. So I'm running a couple of copies of Essence Scatter. This takes away Hazoret, Scarab God, all that. It's just, I don't know why you wouldn't run a couple of copies. You know, like if they top deck an important threat in the late game, you can always Torrential Gearhulk, get an Essence Scatter out of the graveyard. I just think there's just too many good reasons to play this over some other stuff we could be playing. I could see playing Supreme Will maybe in this slot, but I'd rather have a counterspell that we can cast off of Teferi, and that's why Essence Scatter gets the nod from me. We're playing other counterspells in this deck. There are a total of 6 in all in the main deck, which doesn't sound like a lot, but they're all really effective. And maybe the most effective one is the hard counter we're playing, which is not Disallow. We're actually playing 3 copies of Wizard's Retort. Now, we've got a grand total of 7 wizards in the main deck, which is obviously not a whole lot, but that does give us some chance of playing this for 2 mana, and so I think it's better than Disallow, especially, I'll say his name again, with Teferi in the deck. Obviously, if we have a Merfolk Trickster out, we play our Teferi and +1 him, we have Wizard's Retort up, which is a very good play to have up. Hard counters are typically quite good. So, and even if we are casting this for 3 mana, it's still fine. Like, Cancel isn't the best card in the world, but it's still fine in key situations, you know, where you really critically need a hard counter. Cancel's still fine. But if you do have a wizard out, this card just becomes Counterspell, and Counterspell's broken in Standard. And finally, playing a couple of copies of Settle the Wreckage in the deck, because why would we not do that? Why? I don't see what the argument for not playing this card would even be. You know, obviously, I already mentioned this, but we get the Torrential Gearhulk play, which is still one of the strongest plays in all of Standard. You know, just exile everything, At instant speed, they're swinging with. Who saw that coming? Turns out if they know you're playing Gear Hulk and you have a settle in your graveyard, if they're smart, they'll try and play around that. But again, you're in a situation where if they're playing around that, you're winning. So just keep that in mind. But settle's good even if you're not recasting. It's obviously great on the first cast. This is a tool that we have to have because, again, mono red aggro and aggro decks in general that go way up under us tend to just stereotypically at least be a good matchup against us. That hasn't necessarily changed even though we're sort of a mid-range deck. So we still need a piece like Settle the Wreckage to really hit the panic button whenever we're getting attacked too hard early in the game. Now we're playing 26 lands here. We got to hit our drops. We're kind of a control deck. We're playing 5 and 6 drops, so let's play at least this many lands. But as far as individual card choices here, the only thing I really want to talk about is Memorial of Genius because it's boss. This card is really good. It turns out, it's good to have Blighted Cataract that can tap for blue mana. Who would have thought? That card's good. Turns out, everybody, it is. Now, as far as the sideboard goes, we're mostly looking to do well against other control decks and aggro decks that would normally present a problem. So let's look at the anti-aggro stuff first. We're going to play 3 copies of Authority of the Consuls, a copy of Settle the Wreckage, and 2 copies of Fumigate. Now, if we can land an Authority on turn 1 or 2, it really takes away the whole advantage that Mono Red has against us and really kind of makes it somewhat hopeless for those Mono Red aggro decks to win against us, provided that we have some other good pieces in our hand aside from just the Authority. If you get 6 lands and an Authority, you might want to throw that one back, but Authority does make it way harder for Mono Red to win the game, and that's one of our worst matchups, so we'll play a few copies of those. But as far as our anti-control cards, we've got 2 copies of Jace's Defeat and 3 copies of Negate. Now, yes, I will play the entire playset of Negate between the main deck and the sideboard here. I do think it's that important right now, not just for protecting our threats, but for countering huge threats that our opponents want to play. Again, counter spells, planeswalkers. Yes, it can counter spells. That matters in counter wars, but you can counter planeswalkers, you can counter Godfar's Gift, all manner of other wacky artifacts people might be taking up to F&M and stuff. People are trying to make Thran Temporal Gateway or Panharmonicon or, Paradox Engine work. Any of that crazy stuff. Negate can help you out in all of those situations, but it also protects all of our stupid threats that we're trying to win the game off of, so Negate's good for that reason too. And to finish off the sideboard, a couple of copies of Cast Out and a pair of Commit to Memory. Commit to Memory has been in a lot of these main decks that I've seen. It's obviously a great way to abuse Torrential Gear Hulk. If you somehow haven't heard of the trick yet, yes, you can cast a Commit to Memory out of the graveyard at instant speed with the Torrential Gear Hulk. It's in the rules, but it's good enough for that trick. But Commit's a fine card as pseudo removal. It can be used pretty effectively to that end, and Memory is pretty decent if you absolutely need it against Scarab God decks and even Godfar's Gift decks just to wipe the graveyard. But here's where we get to the power rankings, and you'll try not to freak out because this deck scored a total of 70, which a deck has not done in a year and a half or so. I actually checked because I wasn't sure. I think the last time a deck scored a 70 was October of 2016. It was Naya Control, which is actually more of a mid-range deck. But anyway, that deck scored a 70. This deck scored a 70, and no deck has in that time frame. So it's actually pretty big. Not a whole lot of decks break 70, but I think this one deserves to. This has a lot of ridiculously powerful cards in it, and it's not brought down by the presence of a subpar looking card like Wrath. There's a lot of tech with Wrath, and the reward that you get from playing Wrath at relatively minimal risk is crazy. So even with Wrath in the deck, it doesn't really drag down the power level of ridiculous threats like Teferi, Scarab God, Walking Ballista. Merfolk Trickster is a very real card in this format. We get Settle the Wreckage. We get Seal Away, which is like maybe the best single piece of removal in the format, which we get so many good cards in this deck. That power score is real, and the sum of its parts is real too. This deck is extremely versatile, can mostly play at instant speed like a control deck, but has the threats of a mid-range deck. This deck is doing an awful lot, and even if you never play a single Wrath all game, you can win off the back of your crazy threats, decent removal, and real counterspells. Give it a shot, and if you want to check out this deck list or order it for yourself, just don't lick the description. Click the first link in the description and go over to TCG Player. They're my pals. They help sponsor my content, but they also happen to be where you can get this deck for the cheapest right now. This deck is really expensive. I already mentioned that, but other sites have this deck pegged at like $450. You can save up to $100 by checking out the link on TCG Player and ordering these cards. Seriously, when it comes to like really big money decks, TCG Player is the way to go because you can save a ridiculous amount of money in the long run. So if you want to check it out, click the link. There's also the fact, by the way, that like most TCG Player vendors offer free shipping on orders over $25. This is definitely over $25. You'll make it. So if you want to check the deck out, do that. But help me out by doing other stuff. If you liked the video, hope you did. Put a lot of work into these. Just click the like button. Super low effort. Way to help me out. Puts me in more recommended feeds. So do that for me. And you can also do other stuff if you're into it. Subscribe for more deck techs. Hit the bell to make sure you get the notifications because YouTube doesn't want to tell you that I put videos out unless you click the bell. So click the notes bell, get the notifications. That's how that works. But do other stuff for me if you want. Follow me on Twitter at SBMTGDev or throw me $1 on Patreon to help determine what decks come out next and to just know what decks are coming next 24 hours in advance. All for $1 a month on thepatreon.com. I'll leave you a link in the description for that if you feel like helping out. But I'm pretty sure I'm tapped out for now. Make sure you get down in the comments section. Let me know how you feel about this one. Is it as good as it looks right now? Is it as good as it performed? Or is it a glass cannon? I don't think so. I think this deck is versatile enough to handle most of what the field's going to want to throw at it. But let me know how you feel down there in the comments. That's important to me. And I'll catch you cats later. I'm Dev from The Place, and Julie is actually still here. She just sloped all the way down my body. She was lap status at that point. She slowly slid down. You do it again. But in any case, I'm getting out of here, guys. Make sure you do all the YouTube stuff, and I'll catch you cats later. I'm Dev from The Place. Thanks for watching, my wizards. Spread love and be kind.